there, it's Juliana Michaels, and in this video I'm sharing 3 ways to use an embossing folder to create a background for your mixed media cards. And we're going from beginner to advanced. Each technique builds on the last, so whether you're just getting started with mixed media or you're ready to layer in some more advanced products, there's something here for you. We're using the new Sizzix Timholtz Vault Picture Show and Handwritten Celebrate dies to create the focal point on each card. And I'll walk you through how I put that together too. So to create these backgrounds, I'm going to be working with an embossing folder, and this just happens to be the Vault Diamonds embossing folder from Timholtz and Sizzix. I would just recommend any kind of embossing folder that you have that has kind of an all over repeat pattern like this one has. That'll just make the technique a little bit easier with what we're going to be doing. But any kind of embossing folder, it doesn't have to be a 3D embossing folder. That said, you will get slightly better results with an embossing folder that is a 3D embossing folder because the design tends to be a little bit more raised than like a traditional embossing folder. And then the mediums I'm going to be working with on the background are some distress spray stains. I've got Twisted Citron and Peeled Paint, and then I have some Distress Oxide sprays here in Peeled Paint and Iced Spruce. And I'm also going to be working with Sizzix Luster Wax in Gold. Any kind of beeswax based wax will work for this. And as far as the sprays go, I'm going to be working with these kind of sprays. So if you have other similar type sprays, you could play around with those as well. And then I'm also going to be using some Distress ink and ground espresso. So just some sort of brown ink will work for this. For the papers, I'm going to be working with a piece of colored cardstock, and then I've got 2 pieces of Distress watercolor cardstock. And again, I always prefer to work with a watercolor cardstock or some sort of mixed media type paper is what I'd recommend. And then any kind of colored cardstock will work. This just happens to be what I have, that it's like a textured cardstock from Sizzix. As for the embellishments on this card, I'm going to be using some of the new dies from the Timholtz Sizzix release. And these are new to many of us, but some of you may have these already in your stash. These were previously released many years ago and they brought them back. And the one I'm going to be using here is called Celebrate, and I'm using this word lucky, but there are 4 other ones that are now available. So there's one that's called Vacation. This one's Handwritten Love. And then there's Handwritten Journey. And then I'm also going to be using Vault Picture Show. This one, again, was previously released kind of recently, but they are bringing it back so that if you missed out on it the first time around, you could get it now. And then I also have a few that are retired ones that you may or may not have in your stash, but you can, you don't have to use any of the dies that I'm using or any of the supplies I'm using. Feel free to go through your stash and play along with what you have. But I'm going to be using the Gentleman die here and the Alphanumeric Stretch. And then this is the Lucky Love Impresslets. So it's a embossing folder and die all in one. And then I'm also going to be using some of the stamps from the postmarked sticker book. And then as far as the mediums that I used the Sizzix Luster Wax, which I'm also using on the background. And then I used a variety of Distress inks in greens, and then the ground espresso. And then as far as the papers that I used Distress watercolor cardstock and some of the gold metallic craft stock, and then some of the black craft stock. And if you don't have any black craft stock, I have another video that I'll link to in the description box where you can just take regular craft cardstock and create your own black craft stock with some acrylic paint and craft stock. So let's get into it. So as I mentioned, we're going to be doing some embossing, and I'm working with this Diamonds embossing folder from Timholtz and Sizzix. The first background we're going to be creating is the less complicated technique, and it just involves using a piece of colored cardstock, so you can use whatever color you want. And then anytime I'm embossing, I usually like to spray the back side of my paper with some water, so I'm just using the distress sprayer here. And when I do that, you want to just give it a light misting. It doesn't need to be soaking wet. And depending on what kind of paper you're using, it might curl it a little bit. This is kind of a thinner paper here. And then you're just going to place that inside your embossing folder. And I try to avoid going all the way up into the fold because that will just make it a little bit harder for it to close, especially with these thicker 3D embossing folders from Sizzix. And when it comes to the sandwich, the Sizzix machine here has the instructions for working with the 3D impressions embossing folders. So it's just the bottom platform here, and then your embossing folder with your paper in it. And then I like to put the open side towards the center. And if I can go a little bit off, like kind of tilted just a little bit, I will. You know, sometimes the larger folders you just go straight through, but if it's a little bit smaller, I'll try to turn it just a little bit so the pressure's a little bit less harsh and a little more even. And then we're just going to run that through. And I can pull it out here, and there is our embossed paper. And then you just set that to the side to dry. If it's a little bit damp, you know, from the spray, just set it to the side and let it dry, and it'll be ready to go quickly. And then while we have the embossing folder and die cutting machine out, I'm going to go ahead and emboss the other two pieces of distressed watercolor cardstock, doing the same thing. So just going to spray the back side with a little bit of water. Place that inside the folder. And then just run that through my machine here. And then we can just repeat that another time. Now, when you're embossing, if you notice that your paper is maybe shifting a little bit and you're getting your design a little bit off kilter, I usually cut my papers just a little bit larger than the finished size that I want them to be, especially when I'm embossing, because the embossing folder will stretch your paper out just a tiny little bit. And then if it does shift a little, especially with this particular size embossing folder, it might you know, leave you with this little edge here. But if you're going to trim it down, you can just line everything up and trim that off to the finished size. So for me, the finished cards are going to be 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. And so this background piece, I will cut down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches and layer that onto that 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece. So for the first option, which is kind of the less complicated, where your color is already there for you because you're working with colored cardstock, I am going to add some luster wax. This is Sizzix luster wax. So it's just a beeswax based wax that has a gold color to it. And I like to just get a little bit of it out onto my finger. I like to wear gloves when I'm working with this as well. And then I just kind of rub that around onto my craft mat here just to get it nice and smooth on my finger. And then I'm going to hold my hand really flat and then just touch it down on the paper and rub lightly over the paper. And that just really pulls out that embossed design. And it's also why when working with this kind of a wax and an embossing folder, having an embossing folder that has a nice repeat pattern over it is really helpful when you're applying the wax, because you're less likely to kind of have your finger fall down in any lower areas on the design. On this one, it's going to cover and hit all the areas because it's just such a evenly repeated design across the whole paper there. So you can just add as much or as little of this as you like. Kind of the more you layer it on, the more intense that gold gets. And then, if you've got any little spots that you maybe missed, you could just go in and take just a little tip of your finger and kind of rub over those as well if you wanted to. And there's what it looks like with the luster wax on. So it just adds a really nice, beautiful finish and really makes that embossed pattern pop. Now when cleaning up the wax, I usually clean it off with a little bit of some isopropyl rubbing alcohol and just a paper towel or rag or whatever. And just kind of clean my glove off a little bit on there too, so I don't have as much of it on there. And then I can just put that to the side for later. And the wax will take just a little bit of time to dry, so until it's completely dry, it will rub off onto your finger, but once it's completely dry, this is permanent on any surface it gets on. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're working with this. As long as it's not dried, you can usually clean it up pretty easily with a little bit of rubbing alcohol. Hand sanitizer works as well. So yeah, so we'll just let that set to the side and let it dry for a few minutes. And then the final touch I'm going to do on this background is I'm just going to ink the edges with a little bit of ground espresso distress ink, and I've got a little blending tool here, and I'm just rubbing that around the edges here. I'm kind of holding my blending tool at just a little bit of an angle. So it's not flat down, it's just a little bit, maybe about a 30-degree angle or so. And then I can kind of rub it off the mat a little bit there. I like to start off the mat so I don't have too much ink on my blending tool. And then just work around in little circles, and I can pull that ink off my mat onto the paper. And then just continue that around the edges here. So there is a look at the finished background. So now we're going to go on to the second option here for creating a background with the embossing folder. And for this one, we've got the watercolor cardstock, and I'm going to be working with some spray stains in Twisted Citron and peeled paint. And I'm just going to start off with this lighter color here. I'm just going to spritz that a couple times on the paper. And usually when I'm working with the sprays, I like to start with the lighter color, and then usually I'm kind of holding it at a little bit of an angle, so I'm not straight down on the paper, I'm a little bit of an angle, and just gonna press and go. I think that's the biggest key to doing the sprays, is you just kind of have to practice with them and not be afraid. Just push the nozzle and go with what you get. If it's too much spray, maybe back up a little bit so that, it's not quite, it'll be more intense the closer you get it to your paper. So here I've just added a little bit of some water using my distress sprayer, and again I'm kind of holding it at an angle instead of straight down. And now I'm just going to give this a dry with my heat tool. And if you've got a lot of ink on there and it's kind of running, and you can kind of pick it up and dab it onto your paper towel there, because I'm working in a splat box, which is just a cardboard box, and I've got some paper towels on the bottom here that you can see I've been using for other projects, and that just helps keep the box from getting soaked with the ink, and it also, working in this, keeps this from getting all over my work surface, so it's a lot easier to clean it up. So there really is no cleanup, it's all held in the box here. Now, if you're getting some areas where, it's not solid coverage and you want more solid coverage, then just add more spray ink. And now we've got our custom colored cardstock, which we've done with spray inks. Well, now we're going to take the luster wax again, and we're going to do that same process. Get a little bit onto the finger, wipe it around on your craft mat. And then if your paper's kind of curled up a little bit, just kind of bend it the opposite direction to kind of get it flattened out. And then if you need to, you can just kind of hold it down with your other hand. But again, just lightly working over the surface to apply the wax. And again, this is where having that all over repeat pattern really makes applying this easier where you're not going to get it where you don't want it. And again, you can see how that really just makes that pattern show up and just takes it to the next level. And you can also see here too where this wax is going to show up better on darker colors, and there's just not as much contrast when it's on the lighter color, but it's still equally beautiful. So there is a look at our second background option. And then just like on the first background option, I'm going to apply some distress ink around the edges here with my blending tool. So there is a look at background option 2. Now for our third option, we are going to go back to our spray stains, but we're also going to add in some oxide sprays. So the spray stains are a dye-based spray that is, a little bit more translucent in nature. And then these are also water reactive. So when you spray water onto these, that water will cause the ink to move and blend even if it's dry. So the oxides are kind of a combination hybrid type ink where it's a water reactive dye ink, but it's also got a pigment in it. And these will give you kind of a chalky effect, but the same colors. So like the peeled paint and the peeled paint are both peeled paint, but this is going to have a slightly different finish from the oxide. You also want to make sure you shake these up really well. There's a little rattling ball in there, and you just want to make sure you mix up all the pigment that kind of settles on the bottom here before you start spraying with these. That will help prevent them from clogging. Now when you're working with spray stains and oxides, because there's pigment in the oxide sprays, they are opaque and you can't see through them. So you want to spray the spray stains first, because these will not show up on top of the oxide sprays. So we're gonna start with our Twisted Citron like we did on the first one. Get some color of that color down on there. And then we'll add a little bit of our peeled paint here and there. And then now we can add a little bit of our peeled paint oxide spray. And I sometimes I'll go back a little bit farther so I just kind of get a light misting, but you can go in a little bit closer too if you like. You see when I get in closer, then it really just kind of gets it right to that spot there. And then now I'm going to add a little bit of the oxide spray in the ice spruce. And I'm going to go back just a little bit farther. And that'll kind of sometimes give you a little bit of even kind of splatters on there. And if you really just want some splatters, you could also unscrew the cap and just tap on there like that to get some splatters. And then if you want to add a little water, you can, to kind of get some of that flowing a little bit more. So I'm just adding a few little drops here and there of water. And I'm going to give this a dry. As you can see, as this is drying, you're starting to see more of that chalky finish, and that's from the oxides. And my goal was to not completely cover the whole thing with the oxides, but when they blend together, when they're wet like that, they'll blend and create these just unique colors, because you're combining different colors and different types of inks. And this isn't one of those where you have all this control with sprays. So you kind of just get what you get, and just enjoy the process. So if it's not exactly how you wanted it, grab another piece of paper and give it another try, and try something else. Maybe hold the spray back a little farther or a little closer, add a little more water or less water or more of one of the sprays, and just kind of play around with it and just enjoy the process. But I did want to show you, if you wanted to try to, let's say down here in this corner here where we definitely have the oxide sprays. If you wanted to try to add more peeled paint, I'm going to show you kind of what happens here. It looks like you're going to get something when you spray it on, but as it dries, it just goes back to the oxide ink that was there. So you can't really add more of the spray stain once you've added your oxide. So just like I said, the oxides are going to kind of layer on top, and you can't really get much of any effect with the spray stains on top of the oxide inks. So now I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add some more splatters. And this time I'm just really pulling that trigger kind of slowly so I get some of these big dribbly drops, and then give a few little squirts here and there. And then we'll give that another dry. And you can see how that water causes that ink to react. You could also take a paper towel at this point, a clean one, and if you wanted to dab off some of that ink, like look at the cool effects you get over the oxide areas when you dab off some of that. So you can kind of repeat that process as you like. If you wanted to add some more splatters of any of the oxide inks, you could. And like in these areas where it is more dye, in these areas where it is more spray stain, if you wanted to add more spray stain to those areas, you could kind of darken that up. But overall, I think that's good. So I'm just going to finish drying this, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so now we are back to using the luster wax. So we're going to repeat again like we did before. Put some down on the craft mat here, and then just rub that over the surface to pull that design out. Because you almost lose it. Like you don't even, it's like you can see it, but you can't see it as good. And then when you add the wax on there, it's just like, oh, there it is. And now we're going to just finish this layer off with some inking around the edges as we did before. And then here is a look at option 3. So when you go back and you look at the 3 together, they don't look terribly different. So you can get a similar look just using different mediums. So this is the colored cardstock. Then this one is just the spray stains. And then this final one is the spray stains and oxides. Another option that you could also do that would fit kind of in between here is you could take the same papers and ink blend them with your inks. So you could ink blend distress inks onto the paper. You could ink blend distress inks and distress oxide inks onto the paper. You could also just do just oxide sprays or just oxide ink. So lots of options when it comes to creating a custom colored background, and then just varying levels of how to get there. But you can also just use plain cardstock. So to create the embellishment for the card, I took the vault picture wheel and cut that from some white cardstock and some black cardstock, and then I cut the little inside pieces, and I just ink blended those with various shades of green distress ink. I then layered on one of the gentleman dies here, cut from some black craft stock, and then I also used the alphanumeric stretch to cut out the word mind from the same black cardstock. And then I distressed the edges of that just by rubbing over it with a piece of sandpaper, and that paper has like a craft finish on it with the black printed on top, and so it removes some of that black print and leaves you this really cool distressed edging there. For the word lucky, I used the Handwritten Celebrate, and then just cut that from some gold cardstock, and then a couple layers from craft cardstock. And I also did that for the gentleman and the word mind. I cut it twice from the craft stock and then glued those layers together, and it just makes things a little bit more durable so that they're not quite so fragile and delicate. And then just adhered that on top of the letters there. And then for the sentiment here, lucky is a state of mind. I just typed this up on my vintage typewriter, but you could also use a typewriter font with your computer. And then for the 4-leaf clover here, I used the Lucky Love Impresslits embossing folder, so it embossed the shape and then cuts it out. And I just cut that from some distressed watercolor cardstock and inked that up with a combination of peeled paint and Rustic Wilderness. And then I used the luster wax to rub over it and just kind of highlight some of the textured design there. And then lastly, I tucked in a few of the little green stamps here from the Tim Holtz Postmarks stamp sticker book. And then I just glued everything together. And then I've got my embellishment that is ready then to go on to my backgrounds. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed these 3 embossing folder background techniques and feel inspired to give all 3 levels a try. Remember, you don't have to start at the most advanced level. Begin where you're comfortable and work your way up as your confidence grows. You can find links to all of the products I used in the description box below, along with the visual supply list for quick reference. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more mixed media inspiration. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which background technique would you choose for your next card? The beginner, intermediate, or advanced? Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.